Hello, I'm Cheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. I'm delighted to welcome journalist Ginger Adams Otis to the program. A reporter for the New York Daily News, she has focused her attention on the fire department of New York, literally a hotbed of controversy ever since its inception 150 years ago. Always a department comprised overwhelmingly of white males, in contrast to virtually every other city agency covered by the civil service rules, the fire department has repeatedly been called to account for why so few blacks, Hispanics, and women have been able to penetrate its ranks, but with no satisfactory answers until now. In her new book, Firefight, the century-long battle to integrate New York's bravest, Otis tells the story of remarkable bravery and despicable behavior among the men and those few women who inhabit our city's firehouses. The book has just been published by Palgrave Macmillan. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So, what got you interested in writing about the New York City Fire Department and the integration battle?
Actually, it was one of my very first assignments when I moved to the city. I grew up in rural New Hampshire, and I came here like so many young people do, looking for a job in media. And I started working for a broadsheet known as the Chief Leader that covered city unions, and my beat was the fire department. And one of my very first assignments, my boss sort of threw me a press release and said, oh, this group called the Vulcans is having a media availability today. Go out and see what they're talking about. Of course, he knew what they were talking about already, but he sent me out to find out.
So tell us just a little bit, briefly, about how the city's fire department came to be and what it was like in the early years.
Well, this year, 2015, is its 150th anniversary, and that's actually dating from 1865, and that's when the city actually decided that it had to have a paid group of real professionals. But
instead of volunteers.
Right. They were around in a big way for a long time before that because they were, volunteers staffed their local firehouses, and it was a very colorful time in the fire department's history. But from 1865 forward, they said, we really need people who are going to do this full time and take it seriously. And, the fire department has to be its primary, the workers' primary loyalty has to be to the fire department. Before that, it was all kind of, what neighborhood were you from? In some cases, what local gang did you belong to? Or what political party did you support? They were always kind of involved in political intrigue. So after 1865, it became really, you work for the fire department, we take care of you, you take care of the city, and that's how it's going to be.
The department was, and I learned this from your book, it was dominated by Tammany Hall. Mm-hmm. So were most of the firefighters Irish or of Irish descent?
It basically has sort of followed the population of the city from its early days moving forward. So originally it was, kind of very British or Nordic, and those, what records exist kind of show that. But then once Tammany really took root, and Boss Tweed himself was a volunteer firefighter. So once that started to happen, yes, by the turn of the century, just before the turn of the century, if you counted Irish-born firefighters or those born here to Irish parents, it was almost 75% of the department.
Mm-hmm. Now, it was Teddy Roosevelt who professionalized the department and brought it under the civil service rules, which meant, you had a certain exam, a so-called merit system, was how you got to the department. Now, the civil service system, over time, has been extremely successful in bringing African Americans into city jobs, but not the fire department. Mm-hmm. By the time of Judge, is it Garofis? How do you pronounce his name?
I say Garofis. I hope I'm right.
By the time of federal Judge Garofis' ruling in 2011, what percentage of the firefighters were white?
About
males?
That time, it was about 93%.
Right.
Yep.
Right. Which, to my mind, it tended to be, and it was a higher percentage of whites in the fire department than almost any other American city, correct?
Yeah, it's one of, given its proportion to the population,
right.
It definitely is one of the whitest in one of the most diverse cities.
Okay. How did it, What was it like to, we're going to go back to the early days. What was it like to be a firefighter in the early days? And what was it like to be a black firefighter? You know, the first black firefighter came in when, in 1890s?
Very late 1800s.
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
Just when Brooklyn, and actually the interesting thing that we know, and you know, really for all that we know, there might have been more of a black presence, but it just wasn't recorded, or we haven't found it. Because certainly blacks were very present in New York life at that time. But Brooklyn, which has some very deep roots with the Underground Railroad and kind of a black power base, started bringing blacks up through the civil service actually earlier than Manhattan.
Okay.
And they had some real power brokers there that were, you know, kind of leveraging things. And the post office was actually one of those key routes that they had into civil service. So the first actual firefighter, not somebody who was an inspector that we know of, came out of Brooklyn, and his name was Nicholson. And he was, the day that he was allowed to go into a firehouse, the FDNY headquarters sent down an order and said, assign him to the veterinary unit. And he was never allowed to...
So he took care of the horses.
Took care of the horses. He was never allowed to actually fight a fire.
Okay.
And then came another firefighter, Woodson, John Woodson, who, again, kind of through some black power base struggling there, because at that point, of course, the fight started between Tammany and other political parties over voters, right? Getting this new voting base on their, they wanted it on their side. So they had, you know, they had some challenges for sure. They were out there all alone. You know, Nicholson, very isolated. Woodson was much more in the mix, and he had some really good rescues. He acquitted himself very well. But there were some challenges, and he was transferred. What we can see from the record is that he was transferred several times with no explanation given as to why. But there was one time, there's a little record in the New York Times, the officer, he was accused of an act of insubordination, and everything went behind closed doors. But the result was that the officer who accused him of that was found guilty of doing something, we don't know what, that brought shame on the department. So, you know, we don't know exactly what happened.
So a few black firefighters trickled in.
Eked in.
You talked about what it was like to be a black firefighter. The black beds, you know, there were beds that they had to sleep in, usually by the toilet, and no white firefighter would sleep in those beds. They're barred from eating with the other firefighters. You know, you might have to take your sandwich or whatever off by yourself. And they were assigned the worst and the most menial jobs in the firefight in the house. The general question is, how did, you know, when the rest of the city jobs were integrating with the whole civil service system, how did the fire department manage to remain a bastion of white men for 100 years?
Well, that's a very good question.
And was it intentional?
Right. You know, in the beginning, I think it was intentional because it was very much part of the patronage system. You gave your jobs to the people who were part of your base. And at that point, blacks weren't a huge enough number to be anybody's particular base. When they started coming on, and the man that we consider sort of the modern firefighter who opened the doors was Wesley Williams, who came on in 1919 in Manhattan. And then after him, he sort of was able, it took some time, but he was able to wedge open some doors. During his period, from the late 1800s to about when LaGuardia came in the late 1930s, the civil service system, you could say, was somewhat questionable. You had to have a character reference. There were all kinds of ways to get around. It was supposed to be purely based on merit and your score on these tests. And the tests were far different than they are today. They were actually very challenging. You really had to know a lot of things. They wouldn't allow that today because it's an entry-level position, and so they can't test you on your expertise for a job you've never had. But when LaGuardia came in, he changed. He tried to sort of straighten out the civil service system, and he made it a little bit more open to the public. Before that, you know, you couldn't even necessarily tell when was a test going to be given. That kind of information was handed out in the network. And if you were in the network for whatever reason, you could get the information. So once that happened, you could see a jump in black participation. And by the 1940s, when the black bed issue really raised its head, and it was in some firehouses, not by any means in all of them, that's when you started to get, they had almost 80 by the early 1940s of black firefighters. So the civil service was opening doors. The problem is for the fire department that it's just so competitive.
Yes.
It's
right.
really competitive.
Right.
So what you have is, it's like, think of 40,000 tons of water trying to fit through a very narrow hole.
Right. You might have 30,000 whites are applying and
exactly.
5,000 blacks. Right.
Yeah, it's a very small opportunity gap there.
Now, Wesley Williams was a kind of larger than life figure.
Yeah.
He was very handsome. He was half white, correct? He looked.
His grandfather was half white.
He was fair skinned.
Yeah.
Not a dark skinned black guy.
Yeah.
And I think he aced the written exam and aced the physical exam.
He definitely aced the physical exam without a doubt, and he scored very, very high on the written.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, as a New York Newsday columnist, I wrote about the integration battle, and I sway from side to side. It was like, I've seen some of the sample questions in some of the older exams, and they were intimidating to me. Mm-hmm. And I've taken a whole lot of exams, and I would say, why do they need a test that's similar to an SAT exam, and why do you have to take this and get a high score in order to qualify to be a firefighter? And on the other hand, I would say, well, if blacks, signed up for the written test and studied hard for it and showed up and took it and signed up for the physical test and trained for it, then why can't they, get in and significantly increase their numbers just like everybody else? But your book suggests that the whole thing is a lot more complicated than that. And that there were other factors that contributed to the problem. As you said, it's a great job. Mm-hmm. Why is it such a great job?
Gosh, people just really, it's sort of like almost handed down, and not literally, but the tradition of serving is something that the firefighters, men and women, just take so seriously, and it's such a part. So many of them grow up in firefighting families. It's really almost a way of life. It's a lifestyle, and
but also you only have to work 8 days a week. Because you work a 24-hour cycle, and that's 3 days. Mm-hmm. You only have to work 8 days a week, so you can do all kinds of other stuff.
8 days a month.
8 days a month, right? 8 days a month, and the benefits are great.
Yeah.
A wonderful pension, retirement, all of that. So it's extremely competitive. Mm-hmm. So you have all these people who are trying to get in. It's also a lengthy process. Mm-hmm. They give the exam only every 4 years, mm-hmm. and I talked to one white guy who said it took him 9 years to, get into the department. So it's a narrow sieve, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. with a lot of people trying to get into it. We're going to take a short break, and then we'll be back with more with Ginger Adams Otis after this message. Welcome back to One to One. I'm Cheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with Ginger Adams Otis, author of Firefight, the century-long battle to integrate New York's bravest. It's just been published by Palgrave Macmillan. So we said it's very competitive getting into the fire department. Also, you talked about the background checks mm-hmm. that you have to go through. And this became a subjective way of weeding blacks out and bringing whites in, correct?
Sure. So when you had just said that if there's sort of this school of thought that if blacks really wanted this job, the process is pretty open now, and this is how you get it, and there's some simple steps that everybody has to follow, and that's a valid argument. The problem is that if you were, say, an African-American candidate who came and scored really high on the written and did great on the physical and got through all of this, when you look at how the numbers tracked, which I was able to do in my book, you could see that black candidates would, generally speaking, get knocked out of the running even after they got through the exam at a higher rate proportion to their numbers for a variety of reasons. And what the fire department was not really looking at was what was happening on that back end. And some of their background checks, the process for that was not really kind of tracking basic human resource practices. There were no notes taken. It was kind of just in the family. A panel would go over and consider a firefighter who'd been flagged for extra consideration, and he or she may or may not get through. But what they weren't doing was collecting any data on that end, or trying to make any effort to understand, could this perhaps have had a negative effect on the minority hiring?
Right. And you could, if you're a black guy, you could get knocked out for a drug possession when you're in high school, whereas a white firefighter who had domestic violence issues and drug issues would be allowed in.
Sure.
So,
and the research shows that those were not necessarily extremely common, but when you were already dealing with such a small number of black applicants and then blacks who got through high enough to actually make it to the next step, it had a big impact.
Right, why they got knocked out. What really made me understand the central problem was when you pointed out that getting a high score on the written exam, which was the real sticking point, is the written exam that was the sticking point for black applicants, that this really only qualified you to be trained to be a firefighter, not to be hired as one.
Yeah.
And since the real proof of your competence to be a firefighter comes in the training, then why do you need such a difficult test to screen out your applicants, and one that knocks out so many black candidates who might be good firefighters in the end if they were allowed to in the first place? So why did the city fight so bitterly and so long to keep this needlessly difficult, irrelevant to job performance exam?
That's the million-dollar question, and I got as close to an answer as I could, given that it's three disparate agencies, really, that we're talking about here. And the best answer that I could come up with was the fire department really clings to its traditions, and it clings to civil service. The officers there most of them will tell you up and down, like, this is a colorblind, merit-based system, and we should not mess with it, and this is what's needed to keep the public safe. The city that does the actual testing, DCAS, it came out in the lawsuit that they were basically taking tests from the 1990s, actually earlier than that, sort of very late 1980s and early 1990s, and just basically kind of recycling them. Civil service is a tricky thing. It has helped the black population in particular when you're talking about generally, and this is on the national, state, and city level, when you're talking generally about white collar but not uniformed jobs. So as a whole, there are exceptions always, but as a whole, the jobs that are kind of more middle management, more entry level, lower paying, blacks have done very well and made huge inroads and been able to kind of jump to the middle class through that. When you talk about specifically kind of the higher paying, very competitive, sought after uniform jobs, generally speaking, you see a heavier tilt toward whites. You see that here in New York City. And of all of the departments, the fire department is, you could say, one of the most coveted. So that what's true nationally is true here, and we happen to be an extreme example of that. So civil service is a tricky apple to slice because it does work on one hand in leveling the playing field, but not in every instance.
Right.
So what the city never did, knowing that it was vulnerable to a lawsuit because it's testing for a job, but it cannot actually prove. It never did the validation study, that's the technical term, to actually say, you scored 10 points higher than I did. And so a year later, when I went out into the field as an investigator, and I looked at your performance versus my performance, I could actually see, right, the feedback showed me that 10 points actually meant something.
Made a difference, right.
Yeah, it was a quantifiable improvement in your performance over mine. That never, ever happened with this. And it left the city very vulnerable. And it left a lot of firefighters on both sides very frustrated for a variety of reasons. And that kind of was never really addressed. Everybody battened down the hatches. Everybody said, this is a good system. We're not going to change it. We don't want to consider that this maybe is flawed. And it was never really discussed. They just kind of came out and said, we're not going to give anybody special treatment, and we're fighting this all the way.
Were the Vulcans the real heroes in this fight, in your view?
Well, that depends on your point of view. Certainly, they are the ones that pushed this, and it would not, all of the things that happened would not have happened without them. They fought long and hard, and they waged a really astute ground war. They brought in all their political power. They played their pieces on the chessboard very well. And I think that one thing that escapes a lot of attention, everybody talks about the tests as if they were really testing something. And the bottom line is you were sitting firefighters whose job is predicated a lot on how they can handle stress. You're sitting them in a room and handing them a number 2 pencil and saying, take this test so I can judge how quickly I should hire you versus this guy, right? So how many hundreds of thousands of white firefighters, potential firefighters, who took that test, who maybe could have done a really good job, got knocked
out as well.
Right? So the benefit is not just to the black firefighters, although that's who the Vulcans, were fighting for. And that's something that really has escaped the whole argument in this.
Before the federal ruling by the federal judge in 2011, there had been other lawsuits, other rulings. There was even a sort of court-mandated sort of kind of quota system, in place for about 4 years?
Yep, in the 70s.
Okay, where you had to hire, one black firefighter for every 2 whites?
It was the 1 in 3 rule, it was called. For every, I think it was for every 3 whites, you had to hire 1 minority, black or Latino.
Okay, and there were other recruitment efforts as well. There was the cadet program. I don't know if that was the same as the EMT program, but they were
different, but they were meant to work together.
Okay. There was a residency requirement. You supposedly got so many more points for living in the city, but that became a scam used by a lot of. The idea was just to bring more blacks into the department, but you only had to live in the city for 1 day in the previous year
right.
in order to qualify. So that was scammed by a lot of applicants. What were the factors that came together to lead to the Department of Justice finally getting involved? I mean, we know the Vulcans were pushing it.
Essentially, what it was that the city did not want to negotiate with the Vulcans.
Right.
They did not sit down with them.
Budge.
They wouldn't budge.
No to everything.
No. Yeah. There was almost, it was over a 3-year period where the head of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Electra York, tried because the EEOC cannot mandate a public entity, to do anything, but they can suggest that you mediate, that you negotiate, that you come to the table. And they tried, and the Bloomberg administration was not willing to sit down.
That's been the case with many civil rights suits, whether it's over the schools or over many things, where you have city, states, recalcitrant, absolutely, no, we're not going to do anything. So finally, it goes to the federal courts, and they get their butts kicked.
Yeah, I mean, the city, anyone who, when you go back through, as I did, all of the court documents, and you looked at what the opportunities that the city, and it wasn't just the Bloomberg administration, it predates him, and it's different parts of the city administration, different agencies. There was opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to make a meaningful change, but they were squandered.
And so the 2011 ruling, pretty harsh against the city. What did it say? What did it mandate? We got about 3 minutes left. Tell us.
Okay. Well, so the Vulcans, two different claims, disparate impact that the Department of Justice was involved in, and the ruling on that one was very clear. It was made in summary judgment. These tests disproportionately affect people of color,
right,
and they're not measuring any quantifiable job-related skills, so they have to be redone.
Right.
The city didn't challenge that. The Vulcans, on their own, with the Center for Constitutional Rights, brought a charge of intentional discrimination. Garifas ruled, and it's a very long, involved, but fascinating ruling, kind of carried that summary judgment over and said, based on what I have for disparate impact, I'm granting summary judgment on intentional discrimination. And the Bloomberg administration challenged that particular element. Mm-hmm. And the appeal said, okay, it should have been a trial, not summary judgment. Go back, and if the Vulcans want to bring it to a trial, they can do that. They didn't overturn the ruling, but they said do it again if you want to. Bloomberg was absolutely determined that he was going to battle that, but de Blasio settled it. So the bottom line is now the tests are being overhauled, revamped completely. There's a federal monitor, a couple different federal monitors overseeing all of this process. And the fire department never admitted to intentional discrimination. And there have been an increase in blacks and minorities. Latinos have jumped significantly. There are now almost 650 blacks on the department in just a couple of years, which they had never in 150 years, never crossed that pinnacle. Mm-hmm. Where it goes from there that's the big question. Are blacks going to come out? Will it make a measurable difference? Is there going to be a change in the hiring? Or simply because there's just so much competition, is it going to continue to be somewhat out of step with the population of the city?
There is a federal monitor now?
There are federal monitors who watch the department.
Okay. Mm-hmm. I think we got about a minute left. What did you learn from writing this book that surprised you?
Gosh, there's so much about the fire department that's great, and it was very hard to balance all of the stories. And at the end of the day, for me, what it came down to was, whether you agree with this or you don't agree with this, the men and the women who have been involved on all sides of this are people who really care about the city. And there is, in the fire department, there is a lot that they can celebrate in how they have grown with diversity. And if they would embrace that and perhaps make that part of their narrative, I think that would go a long way toward changing that reputation that they have as being a closed unit. Because these are the people who actually do put their lives on the line for everybody in the city. And race is never a question when that's what's on the table.
Right.
And I think that is something that needs to be celebrated. But I think we can open what we're celebrating and make it wider.
Right. It was a very interesting book, and it made a lot of things. This is the FDNY is something I've grappled with for many, many years, and you made the issues a lot clearer for me in reading the book.
Oh, thank you.
And I thank you for that. We're out of time. I want to thank Ginger Adams Otis for joining me. Firefight, the century-long battle to integrate New York's Bravest, has just been published by Palgrave Macmillan. For the City University of New York and 1 to 1, I'm Cheryl McCarthy. If there are any people you'd like to hear from or topics you'd like us to explore, please let us know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.